Creating video games is hard work, and sometimes to make it happen, developers employ crazy tricks to make their game perform better or do things that the game either couldn't or shouldn't be able to do. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 things video games did without telling you. Starting off with number 10, Marawind completely reboots the system during loading screens. This little secret was revealed by Todd Howard on the official Xbox podcast just after the Microsoft acquisition of Bethesda back in 2020. Apparently, they were having a lot of trouble porting Marawind over to the original Xbox. The biggest issue was probably the seamless open world. It was huge for something back on Xbox. If you wandered around far enough, the system memory would fill up really fast, so their solution was to simply reboot the entire thing during certain loading screens. If you actually played Marawind on the original Xbox, it at least partially explains why the load times would be so long. The Xbox was secretly shutting down and turning back on in the middle of a loading screen. What this would do is clear the system memory and allow the game to keep playing, all while the player is none the wiser. If you look into it too, Marawind is hardly the only game that did this. At least according to a comment under a Kotaku article on the subject, Oddworld Munch's Odyssey also used this soft reboot trick as a way to clear the cache. Moving on to number 9, Battlefield 3 when you become the missile. Guided missiles have become increasingly common in online multiplayer shooters, and for the most part, they work exactly how you'd expect. You launch a guided missile and your view changes to the missile guidance system, but your character model remains in place and it's potentially vulnerable for attack. That's how it's supposed to work, at least. For Battlefield 3, either because of engine limitations or some other issue, that's not how it worked. Instead, if you're a gunner or a helicopter and you fire a TV missile, you literally become the missile while it's in the air. Like, your name tag and your health bar appear over the missile and everything. You literally leave the seat of the helicopter after firing it and get teleported back into the gunner seat at the moment of impact. The game must have had some kind of issue with how the whole system works, because it's a pretty hacky way to get everything working. And depending on how everything plays out, it's actually pretty hard to notice. Some people did start noticing though, and eventually started to take advantage by spawning into empty gunner seats while someone else was still in the missile, which could potentially crash the entire multiplayer server. At number 8 is Ratchet Clank Up Your Arsenal. This one's tough to explain a little bit. It somehow patches the game with the EULA. Okay, being a layman, it's a little hard to wrap my head around this, but I'll try to explain it best I can. In this article on GameDeveloper.com, Insomniac Games developer Jonathan Garrett explains how the third Ratchet game, Up Your Arsenal, was shipped without the ability to patch the game, which would not be that big of a deal, but it was also the first game in the series with competitive multiplayer components. So having some way to fix potential bugs, to say it would be helpful would be a big understatement. Now, you think there wouldn't be any way to get around this, but where there is a will, there's a way. And using some technical trickery, they managed to hack together a way to patch the game using the online EULA of all things. Now, if you're not familiar, the EULA stands for End User License Agreement. So they would overflow the EULA buffer. And what that means is every single time Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal boots up, it downloads an end user license agreement, because that can change over time. It's an online game. They might find something that they want to include in the agreement. So that is something that was updated every time. Basically, they sent a file that was oversized and was way more than what the EULA buffer accounted for. And then it would send a second file when it attempted to do the next step. And that second file would tell the game to download the patch, which would then patch the game. So basically what they did was found an exploit in their own game, hacked it, and secretly patched their game, hopefully adding in the ability to patch it further. I don't know if they did that. It actually doesn't say if they did that anywhere I can find information on this. And number 7, in Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the Blood Moon has an ulterior motive. Now, this is one of the more interesting mechanics in Breath of the Wild. They're sort of periodic, scary thing that happens where all the dead enemies get raised up, and it also resets weapon pickups. All that stuff goes back to its normal state. So for all intents and purposes, any modifications you've made to the world that have to be stored in memory, they're gone. The Blood Moon actually serves a secret purpose as well. So normally these events occur at regular intervals. Obviously, every once in a while it wants to clear out the system memory. But occasionally, if the game starts to run out of memory or certain tasks start taking too long, a panic blood moon will happen and clear the map to reduce the load on the memory and other things like the physics simulations. So while most people think of the blood moon purely for what it does in gameplay terms, it actually serves an important function to keep the game running smoothly and is an integral function that keeps the game from crashing. In fact, it's such a well-integrated underlying mechanic in that way that it's almost exciting to find out. Like, in terms of what the blood moon is in world, it actually makes sense with the lore and feels like a sort of heightened, scary event that happens that you have to live through, you know? But as it turns out, it's to clear the system memory. I mean, that's cool as hell. At number 6, in Fallout New Vegas, possibly in 3 as well, they have a very interesting method for displaying cutscenes. You've probably heard me talk about Bethesda's aging Gamebryo/creation engine, and that makes it quirky to say the least. It takes a lot of trickery to get the games working, and that often leads to some pretty hilarious results. Your character's actually teleported to a small room with a movie screen on it for all the cutscenes. Like, the first-person perspective is forced, and your controls are disabled. They even spawn an NPC directly behind the screen to add the narrations. Like, to explain it a little further, it's not playing a media file directly onto the screen. Apparently, there's no way to do that. Instead, they have to make your character completely inoperable, make you look at the game through first-person mode, and teleport you to this little secret room somewhere that has a movie screen and an NPC behind it. The NPC talks, and therefore any dialogue is displayed at the bottom of the screen with subtitles, and that's what's happening. The NPC's name is actually Ron the narrator because it's Ron Perlman, the actor who's always been the unnamed narrator of the series. Like, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't look any different whatsoever from how it would look if they were just playing a movie file like any other game. It's just a ridiculous and bizarre setup, and I didn't have any idea about it. It makes it kind of difficult to take the cutscenes seriously because you kind of understand that you're in a completely different situation than a file player. You're actually in a room watching a screen. It's weird. And number 5 in Wing Commander, the "Thank you for playing Wing Commander" message. Here's a really old one from the original Wing Commander. Software development was kind of still the Wild West in 1990, and a lot of developers were kind of flying by the seat of their pants. This is the perfect example. Back when this flight sim was being made, a developer by the name of Ken Demarest ran into a problem. Whenever they exited the game, they'd get an error message. Like, without fail, when they exited the game in DOS, they'd get hit with an EMM386 memory manager error, which did not look very good in a shipped game, and to be frank, I am old enough to remember getting that error and stuff, which is frightening, is because the processor in most PCs at the time was called 386, and it was managing the memory in a manner that messed up. Anyway, at this point, the game was getting ready to be shipped, and actually fixing the error would take too much time. So instead of actually getting to the bottom of this one, they edited the memory manager so that when it hit an error, instead of giving the standard error message, it would say, "Thank you for playing Wing Commander" instead. So every time anyone exited the game, they thought they were seeing an exit message, but it was an error message. And frankly, that is the slickest damn thing I have ever heard of. Like, I remember getting out of that game and thinking, that's cool, they're grateful. And number 4, in Half-Life, everyone is a ventriloquist. If I recall correctly, the original Half-Life didn't have synchronized audio for all the sound effects. So when Barney presses buttons, he's actually the one making the bleep bloop sounds. The original Half-Life engine was pretty revolutionary at the time, but that didn't mean it didn't have its fair share of quirks. So the strangest was the fact that sounds couldn't come from anything except for entities. So the stuff that moves and animates, like NPCs and guns. So how did stuff like buttons manage to make a noise? Well, they made it so the NPCs made the sound instead. If you look closely, anytime Barney is pressing a button, you can actually see his mouth move every time a button press sound is made. That's because he's the one making the sound, not the button. Doesn't just do that for Barney either. If you see your main guy do anything in third person, like anytime your HEV suit speaks, Gordon's mouth will move at the same time. It's because they have lip sync software going and there's sound being made. Basically, everyone at Black Mesa is kind of a ventriloquist or has some kind of obsessive compulsive disorder or something. Honestly, it's pretty funny once you start noticing it. And number 3, in Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, the gigantic ocean is actually not a gigantic ocean. It's a game that does give you a massive ocean to explore, but not really. The whole thing is actually smoke and mirrors, and probably more than you'd expect, like definitely more than these types of games usually are. When you open the map, the game shows you a gigantic ocean, but it's a lie. When you get on the boat, you don't really move around. It's actually everything else moving around. Those little waves that you see around the boat, they're actually just solid objects that are always under link and pop up to give the illusion of movement. The ocean's just a little box that follows you around, and the islands don't even have a physical location. They just appear depending on your map location. It's a funny thing because this is basically how every game works these days. Your character, to at least some extent, remains stationary and everything else moves around you. If you're not looking at something, it doesn't get rendered at all. But I guess the simple visuals of Wind Waker make it feel a little extra deceptive for whatever reason. It's kind of cool to know that it was ahead of its time in at least that way, though. And number 2, World of Warcraft's Invisible Bunnies. There's a lot of stuff going on in World of Warcraft in secret. Most of it's being carried out by invisible bunnies. As explained by World of Warcraft encounter engineer Nathaniel Chapman for this Kotaku article, there's a lot of stuff going on in this game that is just secretly controlled by invisible NPCs. Instead of coming up with an entirely new system for something like a special weapon used by a boss, they just have an invisible NPC follow you around. Like, for one example, an enemy with a laser turret, they basically have an invisible bunny following you around, casting a fire spell over and over again to create the effect. In most instances, it's just easier for programmers to use the NPC system to generate new effects rather than custom programming for every new attack or trap or whatever pops up. It's just more convenient for them to have bunnies do it. And they got a lot of them running around. 1,000 if this wowhead.com page is to be believed. And finally, at number 1, in Fallout 3, did you think that was a train you were riding? Yeah, a literal narrator is kind of unusual, but when it came to creating a train for the player to ride in Fallout 3, the add-on specifically Broken Steel, the developers really had to get creative. Again, that engine is terrible, and not the engine the train's running on. I'm talking about the game engine, which for some mysterious reason they're still committed to using in their games now. Like, there's a descendant of this engine running Starfield, their upcoming game. If you followed gameranx for a while, you know this frustrates me. Anyway, the problem they got around was a simple one. The Gamebryo engine wasn't going to work with vehicles unless they completely revamped the entire thing, which wasn't going to happen for DLC. They did want to put the President's subway and the train in the game though, so they came up with a creative solution. When the train rolls up to the station, it's not actually a train. It's actually an NPC wearing a subway train as a hat. And to get the train to move, they have an NPC running underneath the railroad. So that was one problem solved. But then they had to come up with a way for you to actually ride the train. Like, once it started to move, the whole thing would break. The engine could not handle you riding in the head of an NPC wearing a train helmet. So they came up with another creative workaround. When you start the train up, what you're seeing isn't actually a train at all. Now it's your character wearing the train helmet and automatically moving down the tracks to give the impression you are riding the train. It all sounds completely insane, but if you think about it, these are actually incredibly smart workarounds for not having to spend like a year making vehicles in their garbage engine. That's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.